Hunting is kind of a similar case in many ways to fishing. And I should actually say that people started to realize the impacts of fishing as early as the late 19th century. And for hunting, they kind of started having the same realizations within a couple of decades. So people did actually realize fairly early on that there was an impact on the population level of selective harvesting of individuals. Now up here is an example that I'll get a bit more into later. This is a silver fox. And these guys were very popular in the 19th century and kind of early 20th century because they had, this is actually, it's a red fox, but it's a morph that looks a bit silvery. So it was unique, it was popular as a source of fur for coats and for other fashion uses. And so people went out and hunted these guys, well, I almost said to extinction, which is not quite the case, but quite a lot. And this happened quite often in northern US and in Canada. And between 1833 and 1934, there's this very well documented century of decline. And it's not a decline of red foxes in general, it's a decline specifically of this morph of the fox. And the reason for that is that these guys have a specific gene combination that allows them to be silver. And if you take out all the silver individuals, you no longer have the silver genes. Even if they've bred once, they're not going to have a chance to breed as many times because you're killing them. And so all of a sudden we see that there's this very rapid decline in this morphology in the population. And this is actually one of the first things that was studied in detail where people realized what happened if you want a particular trait and you take it very exclusively, then all of a sudden you're not going to have it anymore. And in a commercial sense, that was one of the first times that people realized we need to maybe do this in a more precision kind of way. We need to have decisions about how we do this and regulate it a bit more. Speaking of first, this is an example of the first time that someone was able to link that actually with genetics. So at the time that people saw the patterns in the silver fox, they didn't really know about genetics yet. This guy, however, the red deer, by this point, people were aware of genes, and so they could go out and look at what deer were being hunted. They could quantify the genes that were being responsible for things like antler size and body size, and they could actually show that because people were targeting large antlers and large body size, they were also decreasing the number of genes in the population that were responsible for prompting large antlers and large body size. So people, starting to put the picture together of what happens whenever we target specific organisms. One little side note, this is a roe deer down here, and people generally hunt these things, again, for large body size, and also for the number of points in their antlers. Inadvertently, whenever you hunt for those things, you're also affecting the size of this kind of main antler, how big, how long it is, and also the size of each individual point. Who cares how big the point is? I know it's kind of a random thing to focus on. And it probably doesn't have a big impact on how these things function. But the point is that, no pun intended, when you're targeting one thing, you can inadvertently target other things. So here we are focusing on the body size and the number of points when we have these other kind of effects on the side. And this is the kind of thing that we see happening in lots of populations. So we might be hunting for color or for size or for where it's found, but we're inadvertently targeting other genes and other behaviors as well. Just kind of a side note, because this is a bit about Darwin here. Darwin was really close to understanding the evolutionary consequences of hunting, but he never actually specifically talked about the topic. This is interesting because he, at length, talked about selection by man. So he knew that birds were tame, things like the great ox in wilderness areas. He knew that we could remove desirable traits from populations by targeting animals with those traits. He also knew that we could deliberately manipulate traits and cause evolution, his example of the pigeons. And despite all these things, he's kind of tiptoeing around this issue, but he never actually specifically addressed the evolutionary consequences of hunting, which is kind of funny given how very close he was. Farming is something that in many ways is quite similar to the other harvesting things that I've mentioned, and if there's really any particular instance that just encapsulates everything, it is this guy, which is the wild cabbage. And this is a coastal plant that's found in Europe in kind of limestone-y areas originally. Now, of course, we find it pretty much everywhere. And this is what it once looked like, but by Greek and Roman times, it was already being domesticated. That's because it's a biennial, so in its first year, it collects lots of nutrients, forms a nice rosette, and then just sits. And it overwinters in that condition, and then the second spring, it does all of its reproduction and flowers and whatnot. But if you get it before that time, all of those nutrients that it collected the first year are right there waiting for you to eat. And so, of course, people love this. It's very hardy. You can have it right in the worst part of the year, and it gives you lots of nutrition. And so why wouldn't the Greeks and Romans start cultivating it in the backyard? And they went from having 3 different varieties that we know of to suddenly having all of these things today. So this is the period of like 2,000 years. And we've got things like Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, broccoli, a million different types of broccoli, broccolini, broccoflower, purple broccoli, whatever, what we call regular cabbage today. So all of these things are things that we've selected for. What incredibly bizarre morphology. You know, we're eating flowers of things that are hard, and that's what this once looked like. And it's incredible how we've managed to do this over a relatively short period of time. And as I said with the corn earlier, this is not, you know, the only example. We're selecting for sweetness and size and when it comes into flower. In the U.S., we love red tomatoes, but evidently we don't love taste. And it was actually recently found that by selecting for the redness, we have deliberately selected for redness, and that has bred out the sweet taste. So that we've gotten rid of the good genes just to make sure that our tomatoes are a nice bright red color. So it doesn't really always work in our favor. Domestication of animals in many ways is quite similar to the kind of agricultural stuff. And if you think we've got kind of 2 groups, we've got animals that provide products, and we've got animals that are companions. These guys are a type of cow called Belgian blue. And you'll see this nice cut right here. These cows have something called a double muscling phenotype, and it's one gene. I think it's GDF8 or something like that. And it's a gene that has to do with muscle, obviously, with growth. And we have made these cows so big that when the mothers give birth, we have to help them almost all of the time. They cannot push their own young out because we've made them so massive. And pigs are another thing that have been made massive. So this is a nice British pig here. And British pigs are nice and massive because of Asian pigs. So kind of in Victorian times, they started importing breeds from Asia in order to make the pigs get bigger faster. So they were putting on more fat, and they were maturing at an earlier age. And now we have this kind of massive thing that you would never think possible. And what's kind of cool actually about pigs is that they exemplify how when you put animals into a domestic setting, you're actually we're imposing our anthropogenic pressures, but we're taking off natural pressures. And in the wild, you would never find spotted pigs, because it's quite dangerous. It makes you very obvious. It's like having a sign above your head that says, here I am, eat me. But in a domestic situation, we have tons of spotted pigs, because we've removed the pressure on that trait, and it's not a problem, so they have it much more often and breed it into their young. Companion animals, we're obviously generally looking for quite a different thing. So we might be looking for aesthetic properties or athletic properties, so how fast they are. Things like this guy, bulldogs are, I know they look quite scary, but they're actually very friendly. And friendliness is quite an interesting trait.